Okay, I think we can start. My name's Alice Agley, and I have the honor of introducing Wendy Wood for her talk, her presidential talk. Well, as some of you may know, Wendy and I go back a long, long time. When she was a graduate student at the University of Massachusetts, I was a young professor. That was quite a while ago. And we worked together on a number of projects having to do with attitudes and social influence, and some early project on gender, a couple of them. And so I knew at that point she was going to go a long, long way and do a lot of work. And that's surely been fulfilled. So I'll talk about some of it. Her contributions are many. Particularly in somewhat earlier years, she worked quite a lot on social influence and attitudes, many individual articles and meta-analyses. I have a personal favorite from that phase. It's the one on minority influence, which I thought was ever so challenging and done so beautifully. Then, quite a few years later, after Wendy's PhD, we started to collaborate. She'd recovered from being a graduate student with me, and so then we went on, and we particularly have worked on gender issues. And so that's been a very productive collaboration that I've greatly valued. And so we have quite a few articles and chapters. And she certainly contributed a lot to my thinking. I learned a lot from Wendy, in particular her work on gender identity, which became an important component of my thinking on social role. She did a series of studies there, and also her more recent interest in hormonal mediation of gendered effects came into our thinking, which she's developed in a number of ways. And so I feel that my work has been so enriched by the collaboration with Wendy. Now for the study of habits, which is the subject of today's talk, I think Wendy has really brought this concept of habits into the center of social psychology. We ignored it for a long time, because we had all the work on attitudes, and yes, behavior is relevant, but habits were never really the focus. It was attitude intentions and other kinds of mediators. And then social cognition, of course, became such a powerful theme, and that didn't seem to have to do with habits, right? And so it was lost, and obviously very important. So as I think that you'll see in Wendy's talk today, we can't afford to neglect habits anymore. So she has brought rigorous research and some brilliant theorizing to the study of habits. How we form and sometimes break good and bad habits. It's very important to our daily life. So I ask you to please welcome Wendy Wood as president of the Society of Personality and Social Psychology for her presidential address, Planning to Respond Habitually. That's a question.
So thank you, Alice. That was lovely. The talk today is really to help us understand what habits can bring to social psychology. As Alice was saying, they haven't been forefront in most social and personality psychologists' thinking. And part of the reason for this is that historically in the field, there's been a tension between habits and goals. Now, this didn't start with William James. William James was fine with both constructs. He believed in both habits and goals. And he argued that habit covers a very large part of life. He's a smart observer, and experience sampling work that we've done in the past couple of decades has shown that almost half of people's behavior is repeated almost every day in the same context. So this sets up a pattern of behavior that can easily be turned into a habit. William James recognized this and argued that with such a broad construct, we have to clearly define its limits. And psychology complied, and they did so with reinforcement-based models. We got Thorndike's law of effect, we got Hull's drive theory, we got Skinner's operant conditioning, but they didn't last long. They were overturned with the cognitive revolution, and you can trace some of the cognitive revolution to Tolman's work with animals and people, in which he argued that people don't just learn through habit. They also learn through cognitive maps and internal representations. And these ideas were further elaborated by George Miller, who threw out the habit concept entirely and replaced it with information processing mechanisms of goal pursuit. So this was the cognitive and motivational revolution, and you don't get revolutions, usually, without a little bit of name calling. In this case, behaviorists were termed, and this is George Miller's, nickel in the slot stimulus response researchers, and that had this conception of people. Tolman and his followers, in turn, were labeled Tolmaniacs, never a good thing, who left the rat buried in thought. So as a result of this cognitive revolution, in the 60s and the 70s, cognitive psychology and decision-making research developed almost completely separately from ideas of habit. But recently we've seen a synthesis of these habit and goal themes. And the synthesis comes from recent work on automaticity that provides a way of representing what habits are cognitively. Work suggesting that habit automaticity is actually a distinct kind. So, unlike priming and other types of implicit memory, cognitive neuroscientists identified a unique stream of habit learning and performance. And researchers have gone on to identify neural bases of habits and how habits integrate in dual process models as a system, a type of system one, not the only system one, but a type of system one that integrates with more thoughtful deliberation. Okay, so that's kind of where we are now. And without warning you, that's my history part of the talk. I sometimes think history does better without warning. But we're done with that. So I'm going to go on and give you a contemporary definition of what habits are and how they function. And then what can the field gain from studying habit that we don't do now? Okay, definition. So we've all had this experience. You start a new job. You have to get to work. You have to think carefully and plan about how you're going to get there. In LA, we all drive. But you still need to make a decision about what route to follow, what time to leave home. Many decisions. Over time, though, as you repeat this behavior, you form associations that link the context with going to work. So you might form a habit of taking a shower, looking at the clock, having a cup of coffee, and then getting in the car and going to work. This is a model of habit formation because the response is cued by the context. And this is what happens when you form habits. Context becomes more important, behavior is less activated by goals. I have some research that I've worked on with David Neal, who's here in the audience, documenting these cognitive associations. And this was a study that was done with runners. We had people with strong running habits and people with weak running habits in our study. And the question is, what brings to mind thoughts of running for them so that they will act on these thoughts? If you have a habit, it should be the context, right? So we used a lexical decision task. We primed our participants with either the context in which they typically ran, and so they told us this context, right? It could be the track, they could be somebody who runs outside on the road, and they also told us their goals for running, whether they were doing it to relax, reduce stress, weight control. We used those words in a lexical decision task and then showed our participants words having to do with running and jogging. And what we found is that for participants with strong running habits, context activated thoughts of running. Goals didn't bring running to mind for them. But for people who don't have strong running habits, goals were most useful in bringing thoughts of running to mind. So it's as if these people are still having to motivate themselves to get out there, and they are still learning a running habit. Context did not work for people who are weak habit runners. So if behavior is cued by context in this way, if it's habitual and comes to be cued by context, that means that we don't necessarily have, it's not necessarily goal-oriented. So it's activated by the context and not necessarily by the goal. We tested this idea in a movie cinema on campus. We gave our participants stale popcorn or fresh popcorn, and we had them tell us first whether they liked it. Can't make these people go away. We had them rate the popcorn on a scale from 1 to 7. The stale popcorn was very stale. It had been sitting in a plastic bag in the lab room for a week. Participants were quite clear that they didn't like it. So on a scale from 1 to 7, they got a little bit over a 2. Fresh popcorn they liked more, but as you can see, not a whole lot more. But they really hated the stale popcorn. That's the thing to keep in mind. So you'd think if they hated it, they'd eat less of it. And that was true for people who didn't have habits to eat popcorn in the movie cinema. This is the percent eaten of stale popcorn and fresh popcorn. We weighed the boxes after they were done to see how much they had actually eaten, and you can see they are eating more fresh than stale. But that wasn't true for people who had habits to eat popcorn in the movie cinema. They ate the same amount no matter whether it was fresh or stale. And keep in mind, these people had told us they didn't like the stale popcorn. So this is what happens when behavior is cued, right? It's cued by the context that you're in and not necessarily by whether it's something you want to do. We took our participants and assessed their popcorn eating in a lab room on campus where they were watching music videos, and we didn't get this effect. everyone ate the fresh popcorn, no one ate the stale, indicating that when you remove the context cues, people act on their intentions. They act on whether they like what they're doing, okay? So, in all of these studies that we have done, we have also measured implicit goals and attitudes. And we've manipulated implicit goals. And we've found that habit strength is unrelated to implicit goals. So it's not like people are continuing to perform the behavior because implicitly they like it, or implicitly they're motivated. Habit strength seems to function relatively separately from these other implicit processes, and this makes sense given what we're learning from cognitive neuroscience about multiple implicit processes. David Amodio and his colleagues have worked on this. And the point is that many of the priming and implicit memory systems that we think of in social psychology, concepts, goals, attitudes, function very differently from implicit behavior, instrumental behavior. And there are multiple implicit systems associated with each. Concepts, goals, and attitudes tend to function through associative semantic networks, and theories of associative networks have gone really far in explaining many implicit processes, but they don't explain very well the data on habit. So if we take seriously that habits are a separate implicit process that develops through reward learning, then they're acquired through repeatedly reinforced context-response pairing. So it's doing things, being rewarded in a particular context. After a while, the context and the response come to be linked, and the reward is not quite as important in driving the behavior. Habits have a neural basis in the basal ganglia, particularly the putamen and the dorsal striatum, in loops with the prefrontal cortex, and they have the characteristic of being slow to change. So people continue to perform habits despite their intentions. Okay, if you buy all this, we are developing models now of how habits and goals can both guide behavior, right? But we're still developing them. And I'm not going to go into any of these models in any detail. You can read them if you want to. I don't think we have the final word out there at this point. But the fact that many people are addressing these is a positive sign, and I'm looking forward to great developments, and maybe in 5 years we will know what the right integration between habits and goals is. But let me tell you a little bit about how I got involved in this work. As you heard, I was trained as an attitude influence researcher by the best that there is. And I worked in this area for quite a while, but I got a little frustrated by evidence that the factors that change people's beliefs are not always the factors that change their behavior. And one great illustration of this is the public health campaign to eat more fruits and vegetables. So we've had several of these from the government, and the first one in 1991 had great influence on people's understanding of what they should do. So this public health campaign, everyone's seen these, some version of these somewhere. And we all know now that we should be eating 5 servings at least of fruits and vegetables a day. So the campaigns were really helpful in changing people's beliefs and understanding their knowledge of what they should do. The problem was they had no effect on behavior. I mean, we're not talking no effect. We're talking fruit and vegetable consumption has been going like this since these campaigns were instituted. So we're eating less fruit and vegetables, suggesting that there are different mechanisms in control of people's understanding than in control of their behavior, with repeated behaviors like this of eating fruits and vegetables every day. Another thing that was a concern to me is that even when we are successful at changing people's behavior, and there are a number of very powerful interventions out there that change people's behavior, their health behavior in particular, and this is an intervention to get kids to eat more fruits and vegetables at school lunch. You see short-term benefit, which is the increase in number of servings eaten during the intervention, and then once the intervention ends, people fall back into whatever they were doing before. So behavior change, when we're successful at making it happen, is often temporary. And please, if you have examples of these kinds of interventions that have long-term effects, I'd love to see them. So please do send them on. These are great. This is no slam on these interventions because very few of us even look long-term to see what the effect is going to be. So these are really exemplary interventions. But if you know of some where the change has stuck, let me know. I'd be interested. Okay, so that's what got me into the field. What I would assume you're interested in is what can research on habit tell us about social personality psychology and probably the things that you guys are already studying. And I'm going to focus, I'll try to make it quickly, on 3 different areas in which I think habits can significantly contribute to social personality research. And the first has to do with self-control, the second, the nature of automaticity, and third is in understanding why we should study downstream consequences of behavior, what happens after people act, as well as what theories of those downstream consequences would look like. Okay, so let's start with self-control failure. We have a standard model in the field, and it's an excellent model, which is that people fall back into bad choices due to myopia, right? They're focusing on short-term gratifications, not long-term benefits and goals. This is kind of the marshmallow model, right? 1 now, 2 later. But in experience sampling work that we've done, we found that failures include habits, right? Old unwanted habits that people are falling back on, as well as responses to temptations. Both are involved in self-control failure. And habits suggest a very different model of failure, which is context cueing. So in habits, you tend to fall back on old behavior when it's cued by the environment. It's not because you're tempted Instead, it's the automated cueing that gets in your way and gets you doing what you did before, even if you don't want it. Okay? So the habit model is really a context model. Yeah? Context cueing. Jen Lebrecq and I have constructed a video game to help us test the habit cueing model of self-control failure, and this is a screenshot from it. Participants in this study learn a habit. They learn a habit to make sushi a certain way. And what you're seeing is one of the participants. They get instructions about what order to do things in and how to do them, and then they practice. There are 16 steps that involve adding ingredients, stirring, cutting, cooking. Okay? I won't show you the whole thing. So our participants are forming a habit, which is following the recipe in a certain way. And participants who formed a strong habit practice the recipe 10 times. Okay? They learn to do things in a certain order. And then we asked them to try to add a new ingredient. They chose the ingredient. We told them this was personalizing the recipe. They could make it any way they wanted to with this new ingredient. They were all motivated to do so. They reported strong intentions to add the new ingredient. So in a sense, this is a metaphor for everyday behavior change, right? So if you're trying to cut out dessert or you're trying to add fruit to your meal, what you're doing is you're taking a pattern that you've practiced often in the past and trying to do something different. Here, the something different is inserting the new ingredient. Okay? Everybody buy this? This is a model for behavior change. That's all. We're not interested in sushi, we're interested in behavior change. Our results supported the habit model of self-control failure, which is our participants who learned to associate prior step with the next step in the sequence. They had stronger cognitive associations. These were the ones who failed to add the new ingredient. Okay? So if you form these associations and you form them strongly, then you're likely to fall back on them, even when you have a strong intention not to. Okay? So the new insight here is just that habit cueing can cause self-control failure. What yields self-control success? Well, I think this is even more interesting because the standard model, the marshmallow model, is that we are engaged in a struggle with ourself not to respond to temptation. We're trying to wait for that 2 marshmallow option instead of succumbing to the 1. Habit model, though, and this is very recent work, is that people don't experience many of these kinds of struggles. Instead, those who have high self-control, and so these are people who score high on self-control inventories. They respond yes to questions like, I am able to work effectively toward long-term goals. I'm good at resisting temptation. What they do is they form habits. So they do the behaviors that lead to goals automatically. If you think about your own work habits, you probably have met many of your goals in a similar way by structuring the environment to cue behaviors that are going to help you meet your goals and not stress about the temptation of going off and doing something else and maybe having fun instead of working. Some of the work that David and I have done has also suggested that when people don't have the ability to deliberate, they fall back on good habits, just like old habits. So the bottom line here is that people are meeting their goals. People who are effective at doing this repeatedly meet their goals through acting habitually and not through active inhibition. So this is a very different way of thinking about self-control than we've seen in the past. And I don't want to present it as a challenge to existing models, but more an augmentation so that we start to think about self-control in a more differentiated way. Okay, so to summarize, habit-based insights into self-control, failures, best of intentions, impeded by cueing from past habits. If you stay in the same context, those associations will come to mind and cue habits. Successes come from forming habits that meet your goals. All right, on to the second thing. The nature of automaticity. I think habits tell us something about the nature of automaticity. And this has to do with the multiple systems of implicit memory. Each system has a characteristic means of acquisition, learning, extinction, ending, and behavioral expression, the way it's expressed. And you can think about habits as behavioral automaticity that has different mechanisms than the kinds of automaticity that we usually study, goals, attitudes, and concepts. So as I said before, habits are formed through repeatedly reinforced context response pairings. I'm just repeating myself. But you might wonder, well, can you form habits through other processes, right? So can you plan a behavior into a habit? And this is not an empty question, because there is a whole lot of money right now being thrown into the possibility that you can plan to form a habit. And that's all these apps you see on self-help sites, for iPhones, on the computer. Most of these have to do with planning. And they're planning because they involve monitoring behavior, setting goals, staying motivated, being pleased when you succeed and regretful when you fail. It's a big industry in this. So we use the Sushi Paradigm, and you'll see this several times today, so I hope you understood the basic idea that people go through it, practice it a certain way, they form a habit to do the, to make sushi in a certain way. We instructed our participants in some conditions to plan. So we told them specifically, pay close attention to the steps and try to learn them. You'll need to remember each step and do it without instructions at the end of the study. So our participants practiced 10 times, just like before. We know they form a habit after 10 times. In some cases while planning, in this way, and in other cases without planning. Okay? And what we found was fascinating. Our question was, would planning help habit formation? We didn't get an answer to that one. We got an answer to the question of how much does planning impede habit formation? So our participants who planned acted like they had formed a habit. They reported that they were more fluent, and they reported on experienced automaticity measures, which is a self-report measure that's sometimes used in habit studies to figure out whether people are experiencing the behavior as automatic. So they reported that they had formed a habit. But when you assess the cognitive associations that actually underlie habit responding, people who planned didn't form those associations. And remember, those are the important ones, because those are the ones that get in the way of people's attempts to change. So those are sort of the crux of the habit formation process. We asked our participants, so what were you thinking about when you were doing that planning thing? And we did a text analysis, which is really fun. If you haven't done one of those before, it can be really quite revealing. In this case, it showed us that participants who planned used more intentional words. They used effort, try, remember, logical. So they were planning in the way that we thought they would, but they didn't form habits. We're not exactly sure why at this point. We've run the study multiple times to replicate it. We know that planning in this way impedes habit formation. And it could be potentially that planning directs people's attention to factors that are irrelevant to habit formation. It could be that it keeps the behavior motivated, and so it doesn't become cued by context. So people are thoughtfully making the decisions right through to the end instead of forming habits. We don't know, but that's future research. So, in terms of the nature of automaticity, I think that this study on habit formation provides support for multiple implicit theories, multiple implicit systems, that there's not just one integrated mechanism of implicit processes, but instead habit formation differs from other means of acquisition. It also suggests perhaps that what you repeat, right, whether you repeat planning or whether you repeat the response without planning, determines what gets automated, which is a useful insight for web designers. If they're gonna have us just repeatedly plan, we're gonna get good at that. If they have us actually do the behavior and form a habit without planning, that's what we'll get good at. So this is useful insight in an applied sense too. So finally, downstream consequences of behavior. And by this I mean, how do people interpret behavior after they've performed it? And there are many reasons to think that behavior is a very powerful determinant of people's self-concepts and their understanding of the world. I mean, you can come up with 10 yourself, I'm sure, that behavior can be emotional, it can be a public expression, people have strong belief in their own volitional control anyway. Behavior is very salient to people. It's a discrete act. So behavior is potentially a very important psychological process. And theories of habit put behavior, I think, center stage. So it gets us to focus on what people do, not just on what they think and feel, which are also very important, but there are reasons to focus on behavior. We do have some research on explanations for automated responses, right? And automated responses are a very nice way of studying explanations for behavior because people don't have a cognition initially that drives the behavior. So it's the after-the-fact explanations that you're able to study. And work by Adriance and Bar Annan and Tim Wilson has shown that when people act and don't know why they act, they confabulate reasons, they misattribute causes. We're only beginning to understand these kinds of explanations, even though, as I've argued, I think behavior is very powerful in influencing people's self-concepts. Along with Lucas Carden, we did an analysis of how much SPSP, our flagship journal, actually does study behavior at all. So we replicated an earlier analysis by Baumeister and Kathleen Vos and David Funder, showing that in our central journal, we don't study behavior very often. We find more like 20%, they found 18%. But what's even more interesting is that we almost never study the effects of behavior, the downstream effects on psychology. So if you're acting habitually and you're trying to explain it, and you're interested in that explanation, you won't find that in our journals. People just don't study it. It's 5% of studies looked at, and this is a very generous categorization of behavior. So if you took a test and you got feedback on what the test means, that's behavior in this research. So this is the most generous estimate I think you can come up with. But so let me give you a few illustrations of what you could learn if you did study the downstream consequences of behavior. And going back to the original Sushi Study, where people tried to add a new ingredient, right, after they had learned to do the task a certain way, so they had a habit to do it a different way. Those who failed offered some wonderful explanations for their failure. They didn't know it was habit cueing, right? That doesn't make any sense to anybody. So instead, they had to explain the failure. Initially, they wanted to add this new ingredient. They intended to. They liked the ingredient. They thought it would be great to personalize this recipe with their new ingredient. But when we asked them after they had failed, so we have two groups, right? We have those who failed and those who didn't. And initially, they were identical in their assessments of the new ingredient. But the group that failed to add it and so had to explain this behavior change failure said, well, I guess I just like the new ingredient less. Or, I guess I just like making sushi the original way. I must not have wanted to add that new ingredient, even though we have their data showing that they did. And what I like best is the people who are making personality attributions about this habit cueing, right? Just don't find it easy to change my behavior. Or I'm the kind of person who sticks with what I know. So it's as if people are confabulating these reasons in order to explain the challenges they're experiencing with habit cueing. And the problem with this is that these misattributions likely keep people mired in what they're doing. They become self-perpetuating, right? So if you can't add that piece of fruit at lunch because you have a habitual pattern, You make the inference, well, I must not have wanted to, right? Or I guess I don't like fruit that much. Even though before you forgot it, that wasn't your inference. So these can become self-perpetuating. Okay, one other brief, where am I? Okay, yes, one other brief example of underestimating the impact of habit cueing, or in this case, what we could learn if we looked downstream. If we look downstream at behavior, downstream of behavior, we could learn more about how people make decisions about their habits and how they make decisions about other ways of solving tasks. And this is a project that I worked on with Lucas Carden. There's reason to think that people will not have much confidence in their habit. So they have limited insight, right, into automatic processes. They can't easily assess the extent of their habit knowledge. And there was a great theory by Shelley Chaikin and Serena Chen in the late 90s, arguing that people feel more in control, they trust more thoughtful processing, and that's why people tend to think carefully. Not necessarily that it is the best response, but people trust it more. So what we did is we asked participants in a probabilistic association task. We use the weather prediction task in this case. I don't know if any of you are aware of what this is, but it's an instrument, well, it's a learning task in which people are presented with tarot cards and they learn either to respond with rain or shine. So if you got 2 of these cards, does it mean it's going to rain? If you get 3 of these cards, does it mean it's going to be shiny, sunshiny? And people are trained to perform this task in either a habit means, so they form habits, or through learning decision roles. And then after they had learned the task in a certain way, we paid them to give a correct response. So we paid them to be accurate. And what we found is paying people who learned to do the task in a thoughtful way, that energized them. It got them to be more systematic and more careful. And so they use their knowledge more effectively. But if you pay people who learned things through habit, they tend to override the habit. They don't trust it. Why would they have any confidence in it? They don't have any access to it. So they tend to override it, and they try to respond systematically, but they don't have really any systematic knowledge, and they lose money. Very similar effect was shown in some of the work that Hockel and Amodio have done on trait impressions, that in selecting partners based on habitual rewards or impressions that they formed, people tend to override habitual rewards and choose based on impressions. So, what these studies suggest is that people overlook habit cueing when they're explaining their action. They tend to misattribute to themselves self-control failures that are actually due to habit cueing, and they don't have much confidence in habitual responding, so they tend to override it and try too hard when the stakes are high. Okay, summary of talk. I gave you the history, snuck that in. Modern definition of habit gave that current thinking is that it is one type of implicit memory, one type of automaticity. gave some examples of what the field could potentially learn, maybe what you guys could learn, if you considered work on habit in your own research programs. And then I wanted to end with an insight that I got in a talk from Bob McGuire, who was a very well-known attitude researcher early on, and this is a sort of a fractured version of his analysis. But what he did is he said, look, if you want to make a mark in the field, you can address the same questions that everyone else is addressing, but if you do that, you're fishing in a very depleted fishing hole. Or you can decide to branch out and try to do something new and maybe find your own fishing hole. And I hope for some of you that new fishing hole might involve habit and a consideration of the way that habits influence the mechanisms that you're interested in. Thank you to the John Templeton Foundation for supporting much of this research, and to my very talented colleagues and collaborators. Thank you.